All right, starting the Zoom.
Good morning, everyone. As everyone trickles in, we'll just get started. So good morning to everybody on the East Coast and good evening to those in South Korea and other parts of Asia. My name is Natalia Slavny. I'm a research analyst and assistant editor with our 38 North program here at the Henry L. Stimson Center. And I'd like to invite you to this event, Smartphones of North Korea in 2024. So after several quiet years during the COVID-19 pandemic, the North Korean smartphone market is again active with renewed imports of phones following the resumption of international trade and the launch of a new 4G cellular network. Our senior fellow, Martyn Williams, has launched a new report that examines the variety of phones and brand names that have appeared in the North Korean market, providing insights on smartphones and network usage and coverage in North Korea. So we'll put a link to his article regarding the report, as well as a link to a report itself in the chat. Just to keep things quick and short, Martyn's going to jump right into his presentation on details of the report and findings, which will be followed by a moderated question and answer session. So if you have questions at any time, feel free to submit them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them later. So with that, Martyn, please take us away.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are. Yeah, as Natalia said, this is some new research that we've been doing into the current state of the smartphone market in North Korea and also the types of smartphones available. We last looked at this about 2 years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and there's been some big changes in the last year or so. So we thought it was time to update the report with the latest information and also what was going on. So I have a short sort of slide deck to share as we go through some of the main findings. So first of all, I'm going to start off by just going over a little of the background of the cell service in North Korea. I realize a lot of you probably know this, but I think there might be some people here that don't know the background. And the current cell network, as we know it, is a 3G network, and it was launched in December 2008, right at the end of the year. So it's about 15 years since this 3G network was launched. When it first launched, it was covering the main cities, and then it kind of slowly spread across the country. The company that launched it was called Koreolink, and it was a joint venture between the North Korean government and an Egyptian telecommunications company. And then the next major development in the network was around 2015, when a competing 3G network launched. The name of that network was Kangtong, and that network was also run by the North Korean government. So over the years since the network has launched, it's continued to grow and spread the coverage. As I said, when it first launched, it was just focused on major cities. Then it began focusing on provincial capitals, and then larger towns, and also railway lines and major road networks. And what we've seen in the last few years is a real expansion into the rural areas of North Korea as well. A couple of years ago, we did a survey of the North Korean network based on satellite identification of cell phone towers. The map on here shows roughly 1,000 cell phone towers that we'd managed to identify through satellite imagery. And we plotted a coverage area around each of them. And you can see that, especially in the populated areas of North Korea, most of the areas are covered. There are definitely coverage. Some of that might be down to spots in the network. A lot of it, though, is probably down to just areas where we weren't able to identify cell phone towers. We do actually have some more up-to-date information. We are working on a new map, which should show considerably wider coverage than this one from a couple of years ago. But basically, quite wide coverage across the country, not just major cities. In terms of users, North Korea, we estimate, has around 6.5 to 7 fiber lines in 2002 when we did that coverage map. It's a little bit difficult to sort of estimate where things are, because up until about 2018, we got regular updates from the Egyptian company Erascom. But since then, they've stopped providing subscriber updates on the carrier that they talked about. So the numbers are getting very hazy, but we still think that it's something that is popular. Now, a little bit onto the sort of peculiarities of the North Korean cellular network. For both networks, directors have talked about that you need identification and approval to get the SIM card. The SIM cards for the networks come, linked to your name. Having said that, trading in SIM cards has been reported as well, where people needed more than one telephone line. They were able to get someone else to get them a line on their behalf, or to actually buy a line of someone. So again, this is an area that's a little bit unclear because we don't have much information, but there are certainly controls on who can get SIM cards. It's just the free. The phones themselves are standard Android handsets, kind of thing that you might see actually in any country. A lot of the things that we found in the report are quite up to date and modern. But the big difference with the phones in North Korea is the handset. There's some software on them that prevents the sharing and viewing of unauthorized content. Basically, the government has a digital certificate that it adds to files. Those files can be audio, they can be video, images, PDFs, text documents, all that kind of thing. If it doesn't have the government's digital certificate on it, the phone won't display it. So that means that any of the illicit media that flows into North Korea, the South Korean dramas on USB sticks, things like that, you can't use cell phones to watch those because they don't have the digital certificate from the government. So what people can do on cell phones is quite limited in North Korea. There's another application on the phones called Trace Viewer. Trace Viewer will take random screenshots using your phone. The idea being that, if you're doing anything illicit with the phone, you never know when to take a screenshot. Those screenshots are stored into a directory. You know that the screenshot is there, but you can't see what it actually caused, and you can delete the screenshot. So it's a sort of Big Brother type system that permanently sits on phones. There are also outdoor spot checks. If you're walking down the street, it's possible that security services can stop you and ask to look through your phone and read through the text messages you've been sending and things like that to make sure that everything is within the North Korean law. So that's a little bit of the background. The biggest thing that's happened in the cell phone market in the last few years has been the border closure. I mentioned that a lot of these Android handsets were quite good specification. The Android handsets themselves all come from Chinese vendors. North Korea doesn't make them. It's the software that is particular to North Korea. So when North Korea closed its borders in early 2020, it stopped anything but essential goods coming into the country. And it certainly looks like cell phones were not essential goods, because for about 2 or 3 years, it appears that there were no new cell phones on the market. This, though, all began changing. The border began a slow reopening in 2022. And last year, a lot of new phones were coming into the market. Many of them we saw for the first time at an exhibition that occurred in Pyongyang late last year. And amongst those new phones were not just new handsets, but also new brands, new companies getting into the cell phone. Another big change has been the launch of a 4G network. Natalia mentioned that in the introduction. Data NK reported on it last year, and then earlier this year, when I was up near the border, I managed to receive a signal from it. If you look at the image, the bottom line under the South Korean networks, the 46706, that's a 4G signal from North Korea, and that number corresponds to the second of the two networks. So at least one of North Korea's two cellular networks has launched a 4G service. Amongst the handsets that we've seen pre-COVID, there were approximately about 4 or 5 different companies selling handsets. These were different brands that bought the phones from larger Chinese manufacturers. They put their names on the phones, passed them off as their own models, and then they installed the North Korean software. In this report, we've detailed 10 different brands. So the number of brands, the number of companies serving the market has doubled since the pandemic began. So I'm just going to walk through sort of a few of the main brands. One of the oldest companies in the North Korean space is the Arirang IT company, and this is one of its newest phones, the Arirang 221. The phone has relatively good specifications. I think it has a 64 megapixel camera, which appears to be quite common in North Korea these days. And on a lot of the phones, you can see, including on this model, there are multiple cameras. So you've got your, maybe close up and your zoom camera and the main camera as well. Chongsong is one of the new brands. Not a very good picture because we had to zoom in on a TV image of this new phone. But this is from Madusan Economic Federation, which is a sort of large trading company in North Korea. We don't know who made this phone, but if you look in the report, I've got a photo of a Huawei phone that looks very, very similar. So certainly there's a possibility that perhaps Huawei is the vendor that originally manufactured this phone for the North Korean company. Huawei is another one of the new brands that has come post-COVID. There's a couple of phones on this advertising display here, the 301 and the 201. The Mangyongdae IT Corp has these Jindal phones. These have been around since before COVID. What's interesting about some of the Jindal phones is the company is offering several variants in each of its model families. So that the phone on the right there, the Jindal 6. There's also a phone called the 6.1 and a phone called the 6A. So there's 3 versions of that phone. This, of course, is very similar to what Apple and Samsung and Google do with their phones when they release several different models, usually different screen sizes or camera resolutions, right? So it looks like at least one of the North Korean companies has kind of picked up on that as a way to sell new phones. This is another one of the new brands. This phone appeared right before the COVID shutdown in late 2019. It's unclear if this brand is still around or if they've launched any subsequent. It might be that the COVID shutdown sort of forced them into a change of plans because this was, apparently launched right before all of the shipments. Puruhanol is a long-standing smartphone vendor. This is their new phones. This phone, I believe, is called the 9-2, which again hints that there's probably a 9-1 somewhere, which maybe means that this company will have different models of their new handset. And then a couple more brands just to mention here. The Pyongyang brand is probably the best known brand in North Korea for a long time. Reports have said that it is one of the most popular, if the most popular brands. It's from a company called Chekon Technology. It started off with the sort of 201 or 203 or something like that. They're now on the as you can see, the 2436, 2437. They've come out with many phones, lots of different designs, but they're still in business and they're still pushing out phones rather than do several variants of a single phone. They're just launching each phone as its own phone, as its own. And then finally, this company or this brand, Samsung, from Johnson Economic and Technology Exchange Company. This is believed to be one of the popular at the moment. Last year, North Korean Central Television did a feature about TikTok. They were telling people information about, don't keep your phone in the sun because it will reduce battery life. They exclusively feature these Samsung phones in their broadcast. This is images from that broadcast. there are a lot of very nice shots of the phones on display. So we think this is probably a popular brand at the moment because of the publicity it was given. So that's the sort of current state of the market at the moment. If we just sort of recap, all of this is in more detail in the report, but the market continues to expand. New phones, not just from established vendors, but from new vendors are coming on the market. So there's definite expansion in North Korea. All of the phones, though, are the same. They're all from China, but they all have this North Korean software on them, which keeps a very tight control on what people can use the phones for. Nevertheless, smartphones appear to be a gain for consumers, even though they are heavily restricted in what they can do. Smartphones are giving people the ability to communicate, which they might not have had before because many homes didn't have a home phone. They're also giving people the ability to communicate direct with others, just like our smartphones. You don't have to call a house anymore. You have to speak to them, and you can send a message direct to that person because they have a phone. Also, the government is putting a lot of propaganda on the phone network. There's a lot of government news and videos and things like that. There's also other information on there. There are encyclopedias and dictionaries. There's in-depth weather information and things like that. So it's not just propaganda that's being provided. So there are some things of use to consumers. One of the most exciting changes or biggest changes at the moment is the launch of this 4G network. I think it's probably difficult for us all to remember quite how slow 3G was. It seemed fast at the time, but by current standards, it's super slow. I challenge you to switch your phone to 3G mode and see if you last more than about 5 minutes. It is painfully slow, and that really restricts the kind of services that can be offered. So it will be interesting to see what is made of the 4G network, what new services might be available that might help North Koreans in their lives, more than just more propaganda. The other thing, though, that we need to be careful of with 4G is that it does provide the ability for additional surveillance of users. Right now, I mentioned that system that takes random screenshots of the phone. The 3G network is too slow to update screenshots from everybody's phone to a central database. 4G, that starts to become possible. Whether it will happen or not, I don't know, and I'm not suggesting it is happening now. We didn't look into that in our research, but a faster network starts to enable potentially more research into what people are doing on their phones or even tracking them. So we need to be careful and need to watch that. And then finally, the fact that there are all these phones coming out, the fact that the market continues to expand illustrates that there has to be quite strong state support for this. If there wasn't, it wouldn't be happening. And in a country like North Korea, the state needs to control this type of thing. So that, I think, indicates that the state has confidence that all of the software that it puts on phones is still secure and that it can keep people inside this walled garden of content without phones becoming a device for mass consumption of illicit content coming across the border. So they're the main points. If you look through the PDF that we posted, we've tried to put in photos and as much detail of every one of the things as we have. The report is incomplete. There are phones that we don't know very much about. There's also new phones that have come out. We only finished it a couple of minutes ago, but already there's at least one phone that I'm aware of that is not in the report. So hopefully there'll be another version and we'll keep adding to this. But that's the sort of highlight, and I look forward to any questions that anyone has.
Great. Thanks so much, Martyn, for that detailed overview of what's going on with the cell phones and what we can expect to see in the future. We've got some questions trickling in. I think I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask you a little bit more about the methodology of the research and the creation of this report. So if you feel comfortable and you're able to, just give us a couple of details of how you found information about these cell phones, how you found information about the network connectivity, the cell phone towers you mentioned in that lovely graphic. Where are you getting this information from, and how confident are you in the numbers?
Yeah, so there are sort of three main areas of information that I sort of look at, not just for this report, but for I think probably pretty much all the research we do on North Korea. The first one, which we do a lot of at 38 North, is satellite imagery. So in terms of the cell phone network, that's how we built that coverage map. We looked for cell phone towers across the country. They are difficult to spot, but once you know what one looks like, it's easy to see others. They're quite distinctive in North Korea. Big metal tower, building next to it, and a large solar panel. And you see them all over the country. So we found at least 1,000 of them, and that's how we built the network. Cell phones themselves, of course, can't see them in satellite images. So for that, we have to rely on the other two methods. And one of them is North Korean state media. The North Korean state media, especially television, we do see a lot of smartphones in use. Sometimes there are specific features on new smartphones. Like we saw last year at that event in Pyongyang, there was several news reports on the event, and they had lots of shots of all these new phones on display. And the other way that we look at it is through interviews with people that have come out of the country. Usually defectors, especially in the last few years, defectors. Sometimes foreigners that have managed to visit North Korea and have seen different things. Haven't been many foreigners since COVID, but that's now all starting to open up. And in fact, one of the phones that we had on here, I think that Arirang 221, that actually came from an Instagram of someone that had visited North Korea and was at the exhibition and posted a video on Instagram. And I was able to grab that phone and that information. So they're the sort of three main areas we look at for finding out this information. Also, one of the, there are some other news sources. In particular, Daily NK does a lot of really good reporting from inside North Korea, and they've mentioned some of these phones as well. And we've, if you look through the report, most of the information is credited to where it came from.
Great, thanks, Martyn. So we've got a lot of questions coming in. Please keep typing them in the Q&A box. Thank you to everyone. We'll just get started. Paul Smith asks, what kinds of censorship and restrictions do does the North Korean state have over smartphone use? You mentioned briefly that there are some functionalities that are disabled, making it difficult for people to watch foreign or illicit content. But what other kinds of censorship and restrictions are you seeing in the presentations on these phones and in interviews with people like defectors who have had experience with them?
Yeah, so a lot of it is the basic censorship that exists in North Korea. Only access to state information. On the phone network, no ability to call overseas or receive international calls, no ability to access the internet. On the previous phones, we've seen Wi-Fi disabled, so the only network you can log on to is the North Korean cellular network. These phones are locked as well. You can't scan and get a South Korean or a Chinese network with them. And then when the content does come on the phone, there's this digital certificate system I talked about. So very, very difficult to get any type of content on the phone unless it's from the government network. And then when it does come on the phone, it has to have that certificate from the government to be allowed to use it. The phones do come with some apps installed, quite a lot of apps. There's apps that give access to news and state propaganda. There are encyclopedias, there's dictionaries. Some phones have a sort of kind of primitive map, digital mapping, not quite GPS. Apps, of course. I think games. There's a lot of games on the phone. But again, these are all games that have been approved by the government, all apps that have been approved by the government and put on there. Getting new apps again, the apps need to have this government digital certificate. So very, very restricted in what people can do.
Yeah, and just to be clear, there's no use of the public internet available on these phones.
Absolutely not. The only exception is if a foreigner goes to North Korea and purchases a temporary SIM card, they have access to the internet through the cellular network. But then they don't have access to the domestic network, so they can't access the websites that North Koreans can access. It's a completely walled system. Foreign international phone calls and internet, but nothing domestic. North Korean citizens have only domestic stuff, nothing international.
Got it. That's quite an intricate system. All right, lots of questions coming in. Some people are asking if there are any patterns in the cell phone market in North Korea, like in the American market, we might see some phones focusing on the cameras or battery capacity, different screen sizes. Did your research cover those kinds of trends, or have you seen any trends on your own that you'd like to share?
I think the trends are basically following the cell phone market worldwide. And the reason is because a lot of these phones, when the North Korean brands go to these Chinese companies, they're not designing phones. There are many companies in China that have a series of, I don't know, 5 or 10 basic models of cell phone. And any company, even you, Natalia, if you've got enough money, you can go to a Chinese company and say, I want to start selling Natalia brand cell phones. And then you will choose the phone from their catalog and you will buy 10,000 of them and they'll put your brand on it and they'll send them to you. So because they're relying on these sort of basic designs, the Chinese companies are following the global market. So we are seeing greater, definitely over a few years ago, larger screens, better resolution cameras, more memory, faster processors, all that kind of stuff. But that's simply because I think they're riding on the back of the global cell phone market. In terms of local demand, what users in Korea are demanding, that is very difficult to tell without talking to very recent defectors, and recently there have not been many defectors coming out of North Korea. But I think it's probably similar to kind of what we demand. We want phones that work properly, that aren't slow, that don't glitch all the time, that have good cameras. It's probably quite similar, but I don't know for sure what the domestic users are demanding.
A Natalia brand cell phone would be a terrible brand. Someone is mentioning that they saw your graphic about the area coverage of mobile networks. They're asking if there's a similar graphic or information out there that breaks it down by network coverage for 3G and 4G. Is that something that we're able to see through the methodologies that you mentioned before, or how would people get that information and put that on?
Yeah, so the network, as I said, we did it through satellite imagery. I don't think there's a way to determine that map was definitely 3G because we did that in 2022. But I think just looking at a tower, it's impossible to determine if it's 3G or 4G or both. We might be able to figure out coverage along the border because we can receive the signals. The image I showed was from the South Korean border, just north of, in the sort of Paju area, just north of Seoul. The thing that told me was that at that time, which was I think January or February this year, 4G was definitely beyond Pyongyang, because if it was just in Pyongyang, there's no way we would have received it down there. So I suspect the network coverage is starting to grow quite fast, but unfortunately, we really need sort of people in the country to figure out the differences in what's coming off those towers. We don't even know the two cell phone networks. We're not even sure if that's two separate networks or if it's one network, and one is the main carrier and one is like a virtual carrier. It's possible so you can also set up Natalia brand cell phone service, and you can go to Verizon or something and buy a bunch of their airtime and sell it under your name, and you don't have to build a single tower. So we're not even sure if North Korea, if that second operator built their own towers, or if they just bulk bought airtime from the other provider. We think they probably bulk bought, but that's not even something we can tell from outside the country. It's really difficult to do that kind of stuff.
So with all of the censures and worries of surveillance and all of the evidence that you've presented on, what do you think makes it worth the risk for people to purchase these cell phones? Because it's not just elites that are using them for their own work in their businesses. It's also everyday citizens. So what makes it worth the risk?
I think it's I think it's just keeping in touch with people. You want to keep in touch with members of your family. It's an easy way to take photos these days. It's the same sort of reasons I think that everyone buys cell phones. In that respect, I don't think the North Korean market is particularly different. I don't think there's not a sort of huge risk in having a cell phone, unless we're talking about, and I didn't mention these are very different, but there are these Chinese phones that are used right up along the border. They can access the internet, but they're nothing to do with this report because they're not sold in North Korea and they're not technically North Korean cell phones. They're simply Chinese phones being used in North Korea. There is a lot of risk in owning those, but for these phones, yeah, communications, being able to access information, take photos, that kind of thing.
And some people are inquiring, what does it take for a North Korean to get a cell phone and a SIM card? Do they have to have a certain status, enough money, or like you said, are they more focused on purchasing some of the Chinese brand phones that are easier to get at the border regions? What does it take to get a phone and utilize these services?
Yeah, so if the estimate of 6.5 to 7 subscriber lines is correct, then certainly cell phones are available to, at minimum, a large percentage of North Koreans. It's not something that is just limited to the top 1 or 2 million people. In fact, coverage goes throughout the country, and we see cell phone towers in mountain valleys, just covering a small number of villages. So there's definitely cell phone coverage for part of the population. In terms of what's required, again, a very difficult question to answer. In the past, I have spoken to defectors that have told me that you would have to get approval from the party leader in your workplace, and then get approval from your community leader and sort of the local police. That might be old information, though. It's very difficult to understand what's going on today, especially post-COVID. These are questions that, when I find someone that's come out of North Korea in the last 1 or 2 years, these are all the questions I have for them, because this stuff does change. It does seem as well, though, that, like I said, even though ID is required, at least early on in the use of smartphone, you got on your original SIM card, you got a bunch of minutes and a bunch of texts. And then if you ran out of those, it was quite expensive to buy more. So what people wanted to do was get 2 lines, because that original you got was quite good value. So people were ending up you couldn't get 2 SIM cards legally, so people were paying others to get them SIM cards. That doesn't seem to have been a problem. People didn't seem to worry too much about someone getting caught with a SIM card with their name on it. So, it might also indicate that the actual getting of SIM cards, even though maybe technically there is not actually that strict. But it's difficult to tell what's going on now because we have so little information on it.
So would you say that the phones are seen as a status symbol? Or is it kind of a spectrum where a lot of people want the newest thing and they want to have those functions, but also a lot of people are using them, like you mentioned, just in their everyday work?
I think definitely. I don't think there's any difference with any markets around the world. The latest phones are definitely seen as a status symbol. Some of these phones, they come in boxes with like nice, fake leather cases and things like that. Then it's not just a phone. So they come with some nice accessories to make it look nice. So I think definitely, yeah, that's similar to everywhere else in the world.
Great. And you mentioned 6.5 to 7 million subscribers. So how does that translate into the percentage of the population in North Korea that has access and are using cell phones and smartphones?
Right. So the North Korean population is about maybe 25, around there. But of course, you've got really old people, young children, people out eating food. So in terms of the sort of adult, working population and things like that, it's probably getting on for something like 30%. I can't do that math off the top of my
Your
head.
audio cut out a little bit. What percentage? 30%?
Oh, I'm saying it's probably around about 30% or something.
Got it. And someone was asking, was there a discussion of Orascom circumventing US sanctions? So you mentioned that they helped put up the Koreolink network, have since pulled out. Foreign investment in North Korea is not as popular as it may once have been, but do you have any insights into foreign investment in these networks? Maybe Chinese investment has taken over some of the Egyptian networks. So please give us your insight into.
Yeah, so for Coriolink, Orascom is still technically an investor. They don't own, they just sold part of their stake. So I think they're at 60% now. They used to be at 75. They got a dispensation from the UN to continue maintenance and update of the network in terms of sanctions. So they're sort of doing it above board. The reason they pulled out, so they're still technically an owner, but it appears that Orascom started making money in North Korea and then decided that it wanted to take those profits back to Egypt. And any company that's made money in North Korea has eventually discovered that it's almost impossible to get that money out of the country. So Orascom had a big bust up with the government. This is all detailed in their financial reports. They had a big bust up with the government over a disagreement on the exchange rate to be used. And that's when the North Korean government launched their competing network. I have seen some signs that the competing network might be a joint venture with the internet provider in North Korea. There is internet in North Korea, only in a very small number of places, but that is being done with a foreign company. And I think the second cellular network is related to that. The second cellular network, like I say, I think it's a virtual network on Orascom's equipment, but the 4G network did require materials to be brought into the country. And Daily NK, I think, was reporting that they were using secondhand Chinese, I think they might have said Huawei, but I'm going to have to check that. But it was secondhand 4G equipment. Because 4G was launched in North Korea just as 5G was taking off around the world. So a lot of 4G equipment was being taken out of service by carriers. So the secondhand market was growing for it. But yes, Western US companies, they're not building cell phone networks in North Korea anytime. And even if sanctions were not a problem, I would not advise it because I don't think it's a path to making a lot of money. Maybe the Natalia brand cell phone network will hit the heart of the North Korean citizens.
Brand hasn't even been launched and you're already giving it a bad name. So you mentioned Huawei just now, and I know that a lot of Chinese companies such as Huawei and Hikvision have been in the news with their investments and dealings in the international community related to technology. Do you have any more insights into the relationship between these Chinese companies and North Korea's smartphone industry?
Yeah, so a lot of the relationships are of a lot of the big Chinese brands have secondary companies that do these cell phones that they sell to other people. In fact, one of the phones, we did a report a couple of years ago called Reveal, and we looked at a phone called the Pyongyang 2425. That exact same phone was on sale in the United States. But it was the same model. An American company called Blue, I think, had gone to the same Chinese company. They'd bought the same phone. They got their name put on it. They put their software on it. But exactly the same phone was on sale in North Korea and the US. So companies like Huawei have these subsidiaries that do this. And then also there are some companies set up that just do that. And that's where North Korea is getting all of its smartphones from at the moment. We try to identify that. It is sometimes possible either from the design of the phone or from the specifications. If you look through the report, in some cases, we either note very similar Chinese phones or phones that we believe are, exactly the same. So you can see some stuff in there. But certainly, yeah, that's where North Korea has to get its cell phones. It does not have the technology to produce cell phones domestically. And in fact, if you think about it, I mean, almost all the cell phones in the world are these days made in China or a sort of handful of countries that have advanced manufacturing.
So with your last comment, is there any evidence that China is collecting mobile phone data used by North Korean citizens? Maybe not what they're looking at and the apps they're using all the time, but essentially like any kind of data from these phones that are produced in China. Is that going back to China?
We don't believe so. We've had a couple of phones in the past and we've looked at them, and they're certainly not sort of communicating with any Chinese mothership. Also, you know, for most people, if they're using them on the North Korean network, there is no link to the outside world anyway. So these phones couldn't be collecting data and sending them to China. There is a possibility. I mean, the biggest threat to North Korean citizens, I think, in terms of Chinese surveillance is the folks along the border that are using the Chinese cell phones, because they're signed on to Chinese cell phone networks. That's how they're able to access the internet. That's how they're able to message their family overseas and things like that. Most of that is going on over WeChat, which of course the Chinese authorities have access to WeChat messages if they want them. So I think if there is a danger, the danger is in those phones. I think the danger is much less with these phones, and possibly the interest is probably a lot lower as well. I think if I was the Chinese government and I decided to target North Korea's domestic telecoms infrastructure, I would be looking at the phones being used by the leadership. And we've done reporting in the past that has produced evidence that the leadership in North Korea is using a whole set of their own phones that have encryption on them. They're not using these standard phones that we're seeing. So I think if I was going to target anything, it would be that.
So, and in terms of North Korean state surveillance, do you have any insight into how surveillance agents, potentially the Ministry of Public Security or the Ministry of State Security, are tasked with looking for information that's useful to them, and how they're punishing people when they find, you know, illicit content on their phones or maybe WeChat on their phones? Do we know if there's any guidelines on how their enforcement should be made or the punishments that are in state? Like, what are the state sanctioned risks that people are aware of when they're using these cell phones and potentially accessing illicit content?
Yeah, so there's a sort of couple of areas. I mean, I've spoken to some defectors that have told me about the checks they do on the street. So, you know, they're walking along the street and suddenly they'll just get pulled over. Hey, you know, come over here. Let me see your cell phone. And, you know, the security agent will, you know, ask them to unlock their cell phone and then just browse through the apps they've got, look through text messages, maybe look through photos. There is another level on, because these phones are so locked down, they're unlikely to have illicit content on them. People might have USB sticks in their pockets and things which get caught in the same checks, but the phones themselves, it's the communication and the photos and things that have been taking place within the walled garden that they check. There are, however, checks on people's houses as well, and especially in the border area, that's where they're looking for things like the Chinese cell phones, which are illegal to even own, let alone use, because they have access to open communications networks. A lot of the sort of up-to-date reporting on this, a lot of the current reporting, you can see Daily NK does a lot of reporting, Radio Free Asia has done some reporting. A lot of that reporting is sort of first or second or third hand. Usually the way that I do is, you know, if you read all of these reports, you can kind of get a feel for where things are at the moment, for what's generally going on. Individual security agents might be more strict or more lax as well. So you can't take a lot from a single incident, but I think by looking at them all together, we can kind of see what's going on here. The other thing that, you know, the North Koreans can do is surveil network traffic. And one of the interesting things with getting up to 7 million subscribers is it starts to get really difficult if you want to read everybody's text messaging. So then you're starting to get into things like looking for keywords or surveilling certain people. I did speak to someone last year that said the best thing you can do with cell phones is to just, and in fact, in I think all of North Korean society, but on your cell phone, is to make sure you never use it for anything that will attract the attention of the authorities, because once they see that, then they're looking at everything you do. But otherwise, people don't seem to be very worried about what they do on text messages and phones unless they think they're being targeted. So yeah, you just try not to give yourself away if you are doing anything illicit.
So then if there's these random checks that are happening on the street, someone is asking, is there a way to delete evidence that way? You mentioned earlier in the presentation that some phones utilize random screenshots. Is there any way that citizens can prevent that from happening or delete them themselves, or are they just kind of beholden to that technology that's available on their phones?
Yeah, so the app that takes random screenshots won't let you delete the screenshots, and it won't even let you see the screenshot. So you're not even sure what it's collected in there. And that's I think a very effective psychological weapon against people. If you knew that your phone could take a random screenshot at any time, you might be a lot more careful about what you're looking at on your phone or what you're putting in a text message, because you never know when that screenshot might get taken. One of the interesting things though about that app is I am yet to meet anybody that says that when they got their phones inspected by an agent, they sort of had some special device to look at the screenshots. But that app continues on all of the phones that we've seen. So that app is either simply a psychological tool and it's not really used, but it's there to scare people, or it's something that is maybe only used in higher level investigations. If someone gets taken in for questioning, maybe the agents on the street don't have the units or the readers or whatever to look at those screenshots. Yes, I can't remember if that was the whole question or not. I think it was, but
That answers it pretty well. And then jumping off of that, you had that map of satellite, the cell phone coverage, and the towers that are popping up and seem to be more widespread. But if people don't have access to an internet, how are people utilizing this? Do they have to go to specific stores to get apps installed? But then what are they doing at home or in their daily life to utilize these functions and these networks? Because getting a home intranet connection, it might be expensive.
yeah.
You might have to go to a local facility. So how is this cell tower network aiding the people?
Yeah, so a lot of propaganda on it. North Koreans get propaganda all the time, so they've got that to deal with. But in the phones that we've seen from North Korea, there, as I said earlier, there are generally also things like encyclopedias. There are dictionaries, foreign language dictionaries. There are some books on them for different subjects. There's an app for very detailed weather information. North Korean TV has shown farmers looking at these weather maps that have quite localized and long-range weather forecasting and things like information on soil content. Whether that's all TV propaganda, whether farmers really use that, we don't know, but the apps are there. There is at least a mapping app. It doesn't have GPS. You've got to kind of move the map with your finger, but there are hundreds and hundreds of shots of different buildings listed on that. It also has transit stops on it, although nothing real time. So there are a number of those kinds of apps on these phones. Until now, the apps have been installed through a physical app store, which is literally you go somewhere, they plug a cable into the phone and they download. That might be a security measure. It also might be something to do with it being a 3G network and the speed just being fast enough. Maybe we see that change with 4G. There's also a lot of games on the phone. And I'm a little bit of a cynic. I they think that maybe one of the reasons the games are on the phone is to occupy people's free time that might otherwise be used looking at foreign content. But even if you're not looking at foreign content, it's everybody loves their cell phone games. So it gives them something to do with their time when the only thing on television is.
Yeah. So we've got a specific question about your previous report noting that the Pyongyang 2423 was the first to disable external file transfer via computer USB. So in terms of the tech specs of these newer phones, is that now the case with all of the companies? Are they implementing that? What kinds of trends are you seeing with the actual specs?
Yeah, so this is something I didn't talk about, but in our last report briefly, we had the North Korean phone we had in our hands was 2425. We spoke to someone with the 2423. It appears that hackers inside North Korea had figured out a way to defeat the control on the smartphone. It was a fairly complicated thing to do, but they'd managed to do it. And this is the first time we'd heard of anything like that happening. And the way you did it was over the USB connection. So when we got this 2425 phone, the USB just only worked for charging. It didn't work for anything data transfer at all. And we believe the reason was that they had disabled USB as an emergency response because these hackers had figured out that they could get into the phone and use it to install anything over the USB connection. About a year ago, there was a report that North Korea was forcing everybody to upgrade the Android OS on a phone. The last time that happened was probably about 10 years ago, when they introduced this digital certificate system that regulated what people could do on their phones. So we think that this is probably quite a big security upgrade that happened, about a year ago. And we think that security update probably re-enables the USB, but plugs the hole that allowed people into the. We are, however, yet to get a post-COVID phone, hopefully soon. When we get that phone, then we should know a lot more about the current security on the phones. This is another, issue with trying to study this and to give up-to-date information is the last phone that I had from North Korea was a phone that came out in early 2018, late 2018, so 5 years old, and a lot has changed since then.
We have someone asking if there's a breakdown on the ratio between men and women using phones and owning phones. Wondering if women have equal access to phones compared to men. Do you have any insights on that?
I don't have any insights. I sort of, my instinct is that men probably have more access because that's just, North Korea is kind of an old-fashioned society. Having said that, women are the drivers of the sort of underground markets and the sort of, second economy, the economy in the shadows. And cell phones are used extensively in that. So it might be that it balances out with that, but I think it's almost impossible to tell. And certainly Erascom never released that data.
So speaking of that shadow network that you mentioned, we have a question about increased production. Are we seeing evidence of more private vendors selling these phones, or are they sponsored by the government? And if we're seeing more private vendors, what would be the implications of that?
The phones that we're seeing, the new phones, appear to be going through government-run stores. Some of the brands have their own stores, especially in Pyongyang. The Samtaesong phone that I mentioned at last, the one that said was featured heavily on television, they showed this whole store run by the company where they had customer service people that were showing people how to use their new phones, a big display of the phones on the wall. So certainly in Pyongyang, there are cell phone stores as you would understand them to be in the West. There's also a big market in secondhand phones. This 3G network is 15 years old. A lot of people don't necessarily have their original phone from 15 years ago. That's the other thing we've got to remember is while there are all these new phones, a lot of the old phones are still in use because secondhand.
So kind of going back to the big picture of all this, many of these technologies have been adapted and subsequently introduced to the domestic North Korean audience to promote smartphones, more advanced technologies. But how is the North Korean government making sure that things don't get out of hand? Do you have any insight into their level of confidence in making sure that everything stays within the state's sphere of control, or is this kind of censorship leading to different ways that people can try to circumvent that surveillance and that censorship?
Yeah, so I mean, this I think has always been the conundrum, right? The way that North Korea works is you keep people under tight control and you only allow them access to what you want them to consume in terms of information. So only state television, only state radio, only state approved plays, songs, movies, everything is state approved, nothing else. The enemy of a closed society is the free flow of information. So it's always been a little bit interesting to me why North Korea allowed a cell phone network in the first place. I think it probably has something to do with all of the South Korean dramas that were coming in and North Koreans seeing how widespread cellular telephony was. I think there probably also is a real understanding that increased communication does help the economy and does help the country work. So I think that's why they allow it. I think they're very confident that they can keep everything within the walls that they have built. Because otherwise, I think there'd only be one brand of phone and there wouldn't be 10 different brands and there wouldn't be 20 different models and things like that. I think it would be very, very limited because they'd want to keep strict control. They do seem to be doing a very, very good job of it. The hack that I just talked about was unique, hadn't seen it before, and we haven't heard of anything since. So unfortunately, they do actually seem to be doing quite a good job of keeping this all under control.
So then pushing on that a little bit further, how do you see the connection between smartphones and digitization and freedom of information in North Korea at present, and how that affects modern lifestyle for the society and kind of what the state might be thinking about it as it pushes forward with these technological advancements?
Yeah, I mean, I think the digital economy, if you're in Pyongyang, it's possible to order things on a cell phone, so that gives you some convenience. Freedom of information, not helping at all because nothing that isn't state approved is coming on the phones. So I think, a sort of, in the North Korean context, a step forward. But in terms of information freedom, it has little effect. In fact, outside of the cell phone space, the government's been doubling down on its control of information.
So then, Martyn, for you, can you give us some insights into what's next for your smartphone and cell phone and network research? Maybe what are some technologies or trends or signals that you and others in the North Korea Watcher community are looking for, or maybe should be looking for, when it comes to smartphones and wireless technology?
Yes, I sense this in the last question as well, and there's still a bunch to answer. So I'm going to very quickly in terms of research, we're hoping to get some news about that are in the report that we'll be able to look at, see what the state of security on the phone are. We're continuing to map the spread of the cellular network and continuing to monitor the sort of testimonies that come from defectors about the that sort of physical control, the stuff on the street, things like that, to see what's going on with it. Also, the link between North Korean companies and the foreign vendors that are supplying the cell phones. And I'm just going to quickly go through these questions because these folks have given me an hour of their time, so I should answer their questions. DPRK leadership, would they use DPRK produced phones? Probably foreign phones. When the network was launched, the original 3G network was built by Huawei. In the discussions, Korea demanded that the network have an encryption feature, but the encryption keys themselves would be installed by the North Korean. So it's probably standard encryption, but the encryption keys are in North Korean, so it's harder to crack. Are there certain types of phones that are strictly allowed? I think the same things for sort of tourists. North Koreans know very well what they can and can't do in their own country. So you wouldn't take photos of, military installations, all of that kind of stuff. Certainly not also photos of any illicit materials, any foreign materials or stuff like that. So I think you're very conscious of what you can and can't take pictures of. The internet doesn't use DNS as far as I'm aware, which requires users to navigate web sources with IP address. Yeah, don't know how it's changing at the moment, but the last cell phones we had, there were browsers on the phones and there were bookmarks, and bookmarks were just IP addresses. And some of the rumors that we've seen in North Korea on TV in computer rooms, sometimes there are posters on the wall, and the posters usually have an IP address, not the domain name. So as far as I know, that system continues. But again, the caveat is we don't have anything super recent, but it might have changed. Time on average that North Koreans spend on smartphones weekly. Sorry, absolutely no idea on that one. Are they phones used by the government to offer public services? I don't know about the phone network, but certainly North Korea has spent a lot of time doing online distance learning, especially during COVID. In fact, North Korea is already doing it. So while all the countries in the West are scrambling to try to figure out how to do school online, North Korea has this whole education service set up. The reason being that people can't just really travel to Pyongyang. So they set this up to allow people to look at lectures around the country. Smartphones are being used for online payment, not online payments, digital payment, QR code. Similar to China, there are 2 or 3 different QR payment networks in North Korea now. And, the government is trying to slow people to do it. It seems that people are doing it because it's convenient. Also, it adds to the potential for surveillance. But in that respect, North Koreans are like the rest of us. If it's easier for our lives, then we just kind of don't care about all the data we give. And then finally, is someone from the North Labour in another country, they'd be allowed a cell phone. I've spoken to a couple of people that have been the supervisors overseas for contract labourers. The labourers themselves are not officially allowed cell phones. They're not officially allowed internet access. Where they live, they have televisions that only play North Korean content. The people that are in charge of them and the supervisors from North Korea, they do have cell phones, so they can communicate. And they also say that sometimes the labourers sneakily get cell phones. One of the things, if you talk to defectors to do that job, some of them will say that one of the reasons they defected is they were overseas. They were overseas and managed to access YouTube content, particularly a lot of defectors that have moved to South Korea now produce their own YouTube channels and talk about life in South Korea. And that's really popular content for North Koreans when they're overseas. All the questions, stuff.
Thanks for that rapid fire there at the end, Martyn. I think everyone appreciates that you're looking at their questions as well. So obviously lots of information from your report, lots of food for thought here. If you haven't already checked out the report links and the article links, they're in the chat and they're available on the Stimson website and 38north.org and the Lumen website as well. So please go check those out. And thank you again for tuning in and hope to see you at future events.